Princes and Priests. Chapter 2, Castaways.
Anything?
Tavia snatched her dark hair back, struggling to rescue it from a savage gust of cold wind.
Nothing,
Oirion said. He shook his head wearily, his gray hair whipping around in his face as he sank onto a boulder. They had been scouring the shore all day and had seen neither wreckage nor signs of life, animal or otherwise. Life on this lone mountain of stone was harsh and promising to get harder.
"A few clams,"
said Riven, folding his arms over his chest. He kicked open the filthy red scarf at his feet, exposing a dozen clams scarcely bigger than coins.
We need to move on,
Tavia said, disgusted at the lack of find. They had hunted the shore and found little, and in the few trips out in the grassland that surrounded them, they had found even less.
"I don't like it here,"
Kelly grumbled. She had made more trips out into the grass than the others, and liked it less every time. Tavia retied her lashing hair with a long cotton string.
I don't like it any more than you do, but at least we have shelter here.
"We need to do something. We can't stay here forever,"
Riven said, his concern and worry clear in his voice.
Dave!
Oirion looked over to the captain's son, the only sailor who had made it to the shore with them. Dave sat on the edge of a shelf of gray volcanic rock, using the last sunlight to sharpen his Perton dagger. He looked up. His sandy hair swirled in the wind for a moment, obscuring his sun-tanned face.
What do you think?
Oirion asked.
May one hope to find survivors?
Theo interjected over Orion's question. The nobleman was detached from his wife, a rare thing. He stood, arms wrapped around his thin frame, looking unhappy and lost.
"I doubt it, not on this shore. They would have lit fires or come up the beach,"
Dave said, not bothering to try to tame his hair. His focus went back to the silver-bladed weapon in his hand.
"This peak is the only landmark on the coast. Anyone looking would already have headed for it. No, we're on our own."
"I don't like the grass,"
Kelly inserted absently. She turned and went back up the path to the cave, with Tavia and Riven following. The cave had been home for them for the last month. It was cold, full of sharp edges, and always damp. They had done their best to make it livable, but none of them liked it. Oirion heaved himself up off the boulder and folded the scarf around the clams. He turned to trudge up the short, steep path to the cave where the others had gone. Riven was clearly disgusted with the meager find, but anything was better than nothing at this point. At the cave's mouth, Riven stood like a stone sentry, with his arms folded over his deep dwarven chest. His eyes narrowed as he squinted off to the horizon, studying the clouds that were gathering in the distance. As Oirion reached him, he almost spoke, but merely raised an eyebrow and let the other priest pass. There was nothing they hadn't already said about the grass, impending storms, the lack of food, or the need to move on. They just acknowledged the ally they had in each other and let it be. The wind began to drop off, as it always seemed to before a storm. Oirion ducked into the cave through its jagged mouth, plunging into darkness as he did. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the low light from the tiny fire in the center of the space. Riven turned from his post, as the greater moon, Alphen, rose over the eastern horizon and paused just inside the cave opening behind Oirion. Once his eyes had adjusted, Oirion moved to the fire and carefully dumped the clams into the hot coals before he took his place back against the side wall. Riven let Dave slip past and moved to his own makeshift bed. Oirion couldn't help but notice the crystals that hung from the young man's choker. He might not have noticed anything about the sailor, except for Riven's observations about the captain's son's jewelry and shielding. The power within both the choker and the shielding was just another thing here that added frustration to the increasing list of questions and riddles of this place, questions that seemed to have no answers. Neither Riven nor Oirion had been able to pin down the magics, and even as humble as the young man was, it was clear he had picked up training in much more than sailing. They were left stranded without food, maps, or weapons to speak of, on the north shore of a continent forbidden and cut off from the rest of the world. What Oirion would give for that store of mail, swords, and sundry implements of war stacked in the ship's hold. The thought of salvage had been discarded. They had discussed an attempt a while ago. Even if the ship had remained hung up on those spears of rock for some time, the force of the waves would have rendered approach likely impossible, or foolhardy at best. It had been a month of misery and near starvation. Now whatever supplies the captain and his men had thrown into the packs and boats as they rushed off the tilting deck were pretty much gone. If the captain hadn't been so well prepared, they would have had to move out before now. Oirion's skills were insufficient to keep these people alive, much less lead them to safety, he feared. He doubted that his and Riven's leadership, even combined, would be enough to last for much longer. If the two of them had been here alone, they could have gotten on much better. This time, though, they were burdened with civilians. Oirion couldn't help wondering if God was testing them. He wasn't sure if having two high-ranking priests die, or if leaving these people to fend for themselves, was the greater sin. He sighed heavily. He knew the answer. He knew that Riven's dwarven practicality rebelled against the idea of dying in a futile attempt to save them, but to Oirion, the slow death those inside would endure if the two of them abandoned them was unforgivable. It was their holy obligation to stay and aid them. As he reviewed the forms huddled around a reluctant fire, Riven tried not to be bitter or to blame them for any of this. In the faint light, Ivan, like an erect rhino, shifted his massive body this way and that, attempting to fish beneath his mail with an old bone. Riven couldn't help hoping that the unreachable itch would eat through to the man's breastbone. That fashionable monolith, that bald, jewel-bedecked bull, couldn't reach his own itching hump in all that glittering chainmail. The dwarven cleric grumbled at himself for his lack of compassion and empathy. Too many years out in the wilds fighting warped hells in unnamed wildernesses had hardened him and made him a bit cynical. He was less the priest he had hoped to be, and more of the dwarven warrior his family would have wanted, but just enough of each to be neither. He shook his head. What a hollow life Ivan had, killing for gold. Riven had attempted to reform the brute early on in the trip, but the gladiator was in his prime. Both wealthy and famous for it, he wasn't about to admit that his lifestyle was wrong, and certainly not that it might be unholy. Worse still, the man seemed to delight in making others upset. Riven noticed Tavia move from the firelight to her bed. She was laying her son down, murmuring something against his cheek. For a moment, firelight caught her face and gave a hidden glimmer of how pretty she was, even under the burden of her life. During the time they had spent shivering in the cave, Riven had found himself admiring the quiet woman. She had strength uncommon in a peasant, and something else. There was a kind of mystery about her. Her face and arms were brown and lean from day after day in the sun, likely toiling in fields. Her shoulder-length hair was snatched back and tied off with a string. No doubt about it, this was a woman of resource, even though she was compromised by the child in her arms. The kid was a problem. He was a cute little thing. About 5 years old, blonde-haired and blue-eyed, usually with a cheerful smile, he was easy to like. Even Riven had developed some sort of rude, paternal warmth for the boy. But now, in this sober moment, he knew that the child was going to cost them a great deal. Worst of all, he was completely deaf. He slept now, a virtual nursling curled in his mother's arms, consuming nearly every bit of her strength that might have been put to better use. Riven looked back out over his shoulder one more time before he turned his back on the world outside. Something could be creeping in all that waving grass, and he would probably never be able to perceive it until too late. Grass and wind, nothing but grass, and steady, never-ceasing wind. It was wrong. Where were the animals? He hated not having a guard on duty, but they had seen nothing, and everyone was tired. He had never had any use for flatlands, but this place, he swore, was infected with some malignant spirit. He climbed deeper into the mouth of the cave, and smelling the smoke of the campfire, Riven paused. There was a safety in smoke, one of the 4 vapors, a basic substance of the near-lost art of the ancient dwarven priesthood to which his grandfather belonged. Riven smiled wryly at the thought of the old man. He would probably have known how to deal with this situation, but then with a different priesthood came different abilities.
Hac in Suisse, noge suisant.
Riven muttered to himself, reciting a bit of the ancient smoke incantation, something the old man would mutter whenever he entered a cave. Riven walked into the dancing firelight. Ivan looked up at him as he entered, forgetting his itch. A jovial flash of teeth warned Riven that the man had some stupid jest in mind. Ivan winked at the other great warrior of the group, who was sitting across the fire from him. But Kelly didn't give any response at all.
Hungry?
Ivan grunted at Riven, smirking and brandishing the bone like some kind of treat. To Riven, Ivan's voice seemed steeped in gluttony, lust, and stupidity. Another dwarf might have killed the giant for his racial jokes, but Riven, feeling one coming, merely cocked an eyebrow.
No.
As annoyed as he was, Riven was still a priest. At least this time, the jest was at Riven and not Tavia. For whatever reason, Ivan was relentless in his torment against the woman. At first, she had ignored him, but she was clearly getting tired and was very annoyed by his harassment. They all were.
A dog refuses a bone,
said Ivan, dropping his jaw in mock alarm. He chortled and slapped the dwarf on the back over the racial slang.
A treat, I'm sure, but no thanks just the same,
said Riven, stepping away from the fire. He picked up a small chunk of wood from the floor of the cave that the others seemed to have missed in the dark shadows. Ivan, still chuckling, tossed his bone into the flames. Riven chafed. Bones contained a being's power. One did not just toss them into flame. Didn't the half-wit know that fire released energies?
Hoc mof malheur,
Riven murmured softly, trying not to snarl the words. He dropped the wood into the fire with seeming innocence. Embers and sparks flew up into Ivan's leggings. He might not be a master dwarf, but he had the magics he had learned as a child at least. Ivan swore and slapped his shins, trying to save his fine elven beaded boots, then whirled around to spit some threat at Riven. Riven had already walked to the back of the cave and knelt to arrange the beach grass that constituted his mattress. He turned and sat cross-legged, his back against the wall of volcanic tuff. Comfortable, he watched Ivan seat himself, muttering something to Kelly. His expression Riven could not discern through the smoke. Riven had decided that he liked Kelly in a distant sort of way. She had kept to herself on the voyage, obviously hesitant to expose her extensive tattoos. She had dropped most of everything she had carried, lightening the load to keep them from sinking. Ivan had not. He would have killed not only himself, but the rest of them as well, before he let go of his wealth of weapons and jewelry. Outside, thunder warned of the coming storm. The small fire's light barely flickered through the cave's darkness, and talk dropped off as each person tried to find a warm nook to curl up in. Riven hunkered down, in dwarven fashion, attempting to conserve heat, and tried to pray. His thoughts strayed back to the fact that he was so uneasy and that he couldn't find the source. His brain felt clouded, and that bothered him. But even as he tried to focus on the problem, his thoughts wandered. He drifted out of trance and into sleep.
I'm so cold,
Cindy whimpered, waking Riven out of his light sleep. He opened his eyes and looked over at the bundle of silk skirts, blankets, and the whimpering nobility. Cindy was whining. Again. That woman sniveled more than anyone Riven had the misfortune to deal with. Theo did his best, always trying to make her happy. It was a full-time job for him. Riven had the feeling that Cindy would be cold, hungry, uncomfortable, or otherwise unhappy, even in a palace. Theo was trying to hush her, and yet not give in to the affection she wanted. That woman couldn't care less that they were sharing a cave with others. In fact, Riven suspected that she enjoyed the idea that everyone knew what she was doing when Theo normally gave in. He didn't enjoy it, the poor fellow. Most of the time, no one would say anything. They just wanted her to be quiet and let them all sleep.
Now what's her problem?
Ivan groaned.
Mind your own business, Ivan,
Tavia said. She lay near her son, protective and close. Riven smiled to himself. Tavia was smarter than she let on, and a lot tougher than any woman he had ever met. He respected her strength and felt himself drawn to her. Riven let himself look over at the woman who lay just out of reach of him. That might have been the sort of woman he would have married. A strong woman who could be both a mother and survivor at the same time. Oh well, one would never know, and it was best not to think about it.
It's damn cold in here. Is there any more wood?
Dave asked, cutting off Ivan and his remarks that were already forming. Tavia shot Dave a look that was almost grateful. She was tired, and a fight with Ivan was nothing she felt like doing. It was a waste of her energy, and she knew it. Besides, Riven thought, Ivan was too dull to fight with a woman like that. Tavia needed a man with a brain and the ability to use it. Riven tried to settle back down to sleep, but then he saw Shannon. The man stood a moment just inside the doorway, a dark silhouette against the clouds, still faintly lit by the moons above them. Seeing him there made Riven's stomach jump, and battle energies rise up as all thoughts of sleep scattered. It was as if his nightmare was standing right there. He told himself,
It's only Shannon. It's just Shannon.
The man was uncanny and upsetting to the priest in Riven, but there was no reason for him to dislike the Purton so much. Polite, quiet, and never complaining, Shannon was one of a dying race. He did have odd powers for sure, but that wasn't too bad. He certainly wasn't the devil that plagued Riven's dreams. He swallowed his unreasonable fears and lay back down. He'd been here too long, and it was taking its toll. Riven lay awake long after Cindy had been satisfied and slept. He looked over to where Shannon remained at the doorway. The tall Purton moved with uncanny grace as he stepped up and tossed a tied bundle of grass on the dying embers. The grass lit slowly and rose up in warm flames. Tension and hunger eased away, allowing Riven to sink into sleep. Outside, the storm finally broke, and the rain began to pour down over their mountain sanctuary. Riven shifted on the stone floor, dreaming restlessly of feather beds and his childhood home. He rolled over onto his other side to look at the small dancing flames of the fire and feel what warmth there was left. He could imagine seeing his grandfather sitting calmly, shaking his head.
You choose your path and take the consequences,
the old man would say. Even an apprentice priest of the old ways would never feel cold. Hell, they would sleep naked in the bitter cold of Catavan blizzards to remind the people of the strength of the dwarven will. They would say that Riven had lost his dwarf and was now just a short human. He hugged himself tighter and tried not to be bitter about his choices or the church that had made choices for him. He had given his blanket up to try to keep Cindy quiet, but that seemed to be a wasted effort. She was whimpering again, and poor Theo was trying to hush her enough that the rest of them could sleep. They were all restless. Riven watched as Dave pulled his blanket over his head, considering him as a source of help in the plight. Even at his young age, Dave was a force to be reckoned with. A muscular young man in his late teens, or maybe early 20s, he was already sporting gold rings in his ears and tattoos on his upper arm. The tattoos were elaborate bands that clearly identified him in the world of pirates, sailors, and the enemies they faced out on the waters. There was power in those tattoos. Riven chewed his beard in irritation at not knowing how to read them. Any common dwarf would know their meaning. He had to remind himself that no common dwarf could do the things that he did on a regular basis. They had their magic and knowledge, and he had his. It was a trade-off that he knew was worth it. This situation just leaned more toward traditional skills that he knew he lacked. Giving up trying to sleep, he sat up, wishing he had the tools to make a set of beads. He had no beads, and his old tattered Book of Saints was lost. He'd lost his book, his satchel of artifacts, and even his pipe. He was stranded here with not even a smoke to calm his nerves. Perhaps it was God's way of telling him to quit. He twisted his ordination ring on his left little finger. It was a habit of stress that Riven had developed over the years, a mannerism that every priest he knew had. His thoughts moved back to the problems that the group faced. They all disliked the grass, yet they all agreed that they had to move on. The conversation always seemed to die, and nothing was ever decided. He tried to reason out why, but beyond the expanse, he saw no reason to dislike it so much. He was a cleric, a priest of a church that was older than any nation in the world, and that ruled most of it. He was trained to fight the mindless and warped beasts of the lands that had been twisted by the use of magic during various wars. He was trained to be able to survive and to purify lands like this one. That was his job. So, why was he hesitating? What was his problem? Why couldn't he think past this uneasy sense that it was all wrong? Riven watched Oirion push himself up and silently pull the blanket around his shoulders. The man slept restlessly when he slept at all. Riven could see the flash of gold as the man's prayer beads came out of some inner pocket. Riven considered walking over to where the hunter was. He didn't feel like talking about the same things again, so what would he say? Oirion might be humble, but he was far from poverty-ridden. Riven wasn't sure he had anything in common with the son of the greatest house in Valreen. It was nice to have another member of the Sixth Kingdom here. They alone, of all the priesthoods, were allowed to possess and master battle magic. It was necessary. They fought the living evils of the world. They were the ones who dealt with the vampires, the ghouls, the warped creatures and lands. Oirion was famous among the Order as well in the world of politics. He was heir to one of the most powerful families in all Pert. It was whispered one day he would be made to leave the priesthood in order to be made king of Valreen. Riven sighed heavily and bowed his head. Oirion was more helpful than a priest of any other order would have been, and unlike any nobleman Riven had ever met, but they were still hopelessly alone. Riven wondered where Orion's partner was. The healer's presence would have been a great boon, not to mention his legendary skill as a fighter. James something or other. The pair were famous enough that Riven knew of their exploits. It was a funny irony that Ivan was likely to be, at best, third on the list for skill as a warrior, and maybe lower with Dave and Kelly in the group. Riven couldn't help but wonder if any of the others here had any idea who Oirion was, or how lucky they were to have him along. He certainly gave no indication as to his identity. Tomorrow, he'd talk to him about it all tomorrow. Oirion stood at the bottom of the lone peak, right at the edge of the grass. He ignored the chill and rain of the early morning, looking out at the land beyond and scanned for human life. There was still none within 50 miles. He didn't waste the energy to look farther. He knew what was out there. He had reached out as far as his magic allowed, and there was nothing. The grassland went from the coast to foothills far to the south. Mountains, small and blue, rose up out of the sea of grass, often being lost in the clouds that might be on the low horizon. To the north and the east was the ocean, gray and flat. There was no sign of any sort of life. There were no villages, no ships, no fires, nothing. Always nothing. Riven came out, a silent ghost almost lost in the gray rain, and joined Oirion. He stood a moment, his cloak soaking up more rain than it shed. They needed to move on to better shelter while summer still lasted, but something about the grassland didn't feel right.
We have to move out of here,
Riven said softly. Oirion nodded.
To where?
The question hung. Neither one had an answer. Neither wanted to make the call that would get these people killed, but it had to be made. Riven turned and headed back to the cave. Getting soaked wouldn't help their morale or their health. That was all they needed. To get a chill would just top it all off. As little as either of them had slept or eaten in the last month, it was a real possibility. Oirion turned to follow Riven back up the narrow winding path. His mind began to wander. The gray drizzle brought up memories of Jamie. Guilt and grief made him feel sick, so he pushed them out of his head and followed the dwarf back to the cave. Riven was talking to Dave by the time Oirion ducked inside. The cleric was a true dwarf, not the waddling smallborn that people often referred to as dwarves, but a real one, and he had made it over this mountain much faster than Oirion did. Riven was solidly muscled. He had agility and speed that could pass up the fastest human, rival an elf, and even, it was said, compete with a Perton. They were a powerful race, and all were far more dangerous than they looked. A dwarf was a 4.5-foot warrior that had almost unfair advantages. He could see in the dark, had the ability to traverse caves unerringly, and had a sense of smell rivaling that of a wolf. Dwarves were the best hunters and better clerics than any other race except Pertons. Oirion walked over to the only two men in the group whom he would have chosen to talk to, let alone live with.
We need to move before we starve up here anyway,
Dave was saying to the dwarf.
Winter comes early this far north, and especially on a coast that has the Arctic current against it.
I agree.
Ivan spoke up, glancing up from picking at his fingernails with his knife. He had an expression of concern, the first look Oirion had seen out of the man that was not total stupidity.
I'm loath to cross those hills and with so few weapons,
Kelly said, barely above a whisper, as if she disliked her own voice. Oirion wondered about the tattoos the big woman tried to keep hidden and what they meant. He considered asking Dave later. The two certainly kept distance between each other, and that made Oirion a little nervous about trusting the woman.
Shouldn't we wait?
Theo asked as he joined them at the fire. The little man reminded Oirion of his brothers. He held back 1,000 harsh remarks that he would have said to one of them. Theo was more suited for the delicate sides of court than trying to survive anywhere outside a palace. Orion's brothers certainly excelled at that type of lifestyle, but had no real skill beyond greed and gossip.
There won't be a rescue,
Dave reasoned.
We're inside the barrier now. No one is coming from the outside to get to us.
He looked up at the other young man, shaking his hair out of his face, and then patiently explained,
The rain won't stay rain for long. If we stay here, we'll starve or freeze to death.
What then?
Ivan blurted.
We go. It don't matter to me. I can defend myself.
He puffed up his chest to show off his fine silver mesh armor.
Besides, if there was something out there, we would have seen it by now. It would have made a noise at least.
Oirion found the man's bravado irritating, but ignored it as thoughts of his own weapons rose in his mind. They had been shipped ahead to his father's house. Now he was missing the comfort of his staff and sword, but there was little help for it. He promised himself again to never travel unarmed.
Maybe we can ask Shannon,
Dave suggested. It seemed to Oirion that he had heard that name somewhere before, but he couldn't think of where. That troubled him. It wasn't the first time he felt that he had met the man, or at least that he should know who Shannon was. The Perton did not bode well with the hunter in Oirion. There was no sign, action, or word to give him a reason not to like Shannon, but Oirion felt that there was something very wrong about him, as well as something sinister about his perfection. Even now, he looked fresh from the bathhouse, cool and collected, unruffled and unsoiled. Hell, the man didn't even need a shave. A month had passed, and he was still flawless. Oirion rubbed at his own dense beard, which had grown over the last few months, and thought how nice it would be to never have to shave again.
I don't like the grassland either, but I'm no expert. I'd advise we ask Shannon,
Dave said quickly, once again cutting off an argument between Ivan and Tavia. Oirion was grateful for that. He really didn't want to sit through another of those fights, but it was unlike the young man to bring up Shannon twice.
Shannon?
He asked Dave, his thoughts momentarily distracted, returning to the suggestion. Oirion wondered if Dave had said it again to further distract Ivan from his remarks to the woman, or for some other reason. Dave shrugged.
Maybe he knows something. He's been out there every day so far.
Go ahead then,
Ivan said, almost daring him.
Go ask him.
Dave gave Ivan a dirty look but got up. He ducked out and went over to where Shannon was standing, statue-like, looking away toward the southeast.
Shannon,
Dave said, a little nervously at the man's elbow. Shannon looked over.
We were talking about leaving, but none of us like the look of the grassland.
It will have to be crossed, whether we like it or not,
Shannon said, speaking in the pert whisper he always used.
You don't like it either?
Dave asked, almost relieved and partly excited by the confirmation of his own fears. Shannon smiled slightly, as if he understood what Dave was thinking.
Look out there, David. Look close enough, and you will see the threat.
I don't see anything,
Dave said, looking out, trying to see whatever it was, not just rain. He hated to admit it, but he saw nothing he hadn't already seen 1,000 times.
Use your other vision,
Shannon said softly. Dave swallowed deeply and looked over at the man with a little uncertainty. Shannon had been teaching him magic for as long as he could recall. The first lesson was that everything had a power that affected everything else. There were rivers of power that in places trickled, while other places roared wild and untamable. Streams met to form pools, even oceans. Some were calm and sweet, others were roaring and seething. Every thought, action, and breath affected this energy, and that energy affected everything in turn. The more power you had, the more you could see. Shannon had taught him to use this power to scan for pirates, storms, and other dangers on the waters, but there were 1,000 applications of it. This energy was what wizards used in their magic, even if not all of them could see it. If one knew how to see this field, and if that person could understand what he saw, the world and life itself took on a whole new meaning. Dave had not used the power much, not since he had begun to fear the man who had taught it to him, or the church that condemned it. What Shannon asked was dangerous. There were priests here, and what if they saw? He wasn't going to refuse, however. You simply didn't tell Shannon no. It took a moment to shift his vision to that of sight. Then he wondered if he had done it right. There was nothing out there but the grass. There were no animals, no trails, and no movement. He looked over to Shannon. Shannon looked so normal, like any other person. There was no special glow, no hint of the truth of his power. Knowing better than to believe the lie of what seemed to be, Dave looked away, wondering how much he didn't know about his uncle. What else was a mask to hide the real man inside the shields that were worn? The thought only made him feel even more uneasy. He blinked the sight away.
There's nothing out there,
Dave said softly, his voice momentarily tight, but he cleared his throat and looked over.
Takes on a whole new meaning when you see it that way, does it not?
Shannon said, sounding almost amused.
The question is why.
He looked at Dave with ice-blue eyes, the same eyes Dave's father had.
Can we cross it?
Dave asked. He felt a sort of chill that didn't come from Shannon, but made him glad for the man's presence.
We have no choice,
Shannon said, ending the conversation as he looked back out to the grass. Dave turned to the others. They all waited, crowded in the cave door. They moved inside as he walked toward them. Returning, he knelt down by the fire, trying to understand well enough what he had seen to explain it to them without revealing that he had powers, or that he knew Shannon.
Well?
Oirion asked.
There's nothing out there,
Dave said.
No life, no death. There aren't even any crickets, only grass and wind.
Well, there's a revelation,
Ivan said, rolling his eyes in disgust.
Why not?
Riven asked, speaking more to himself than to anyone else at the fire. The revelation was obvious and unnerving in that he should have seen it at once.
Whatever it is, we fight it.
Kelly said.
If we're strong enough, we'll survive. If not, we will be joining the crickets.
So what do we do? Do we go now?
Tavia asked.
No,
Riven said, considering.
let's wait until morning. Besides, I think that it would be good for us to do a blessing before we set out, and that could take hours. I need time to prepare.
Do we have any more wine?
Oirion asked Dave softly.
I'll look,
Dave said, getting up to check the last of the stores. Dave could not sleep. He gave up and got up from his bed in the dark, drawing his blanket about his shoulders. What was left of the fire was low and banked for a good reason. God only knew who or what would notice a fire. He stepped away from the others. Standing in the doorway, he watched the clouds move across the faint orbs of the moons.
You should be sleeping,
Shannon said. Dave didn't bother to hide the start the Purton gave him. Shannon had approached Dave in utter silence. It was uncanny. While a fun game when he was a child, it was just unnerving now.
I can't relax. I'm worried for the captain,
he admitted.
Aren't you, Uncle?
Elliot is well enough,
Shannon said. He put a hand on Dave's shoulder.
His path is headed south. He is alive, and he is not alone. I can tell you that for certain, and I would not lie. We have no hope of joining him any time soon, but one day, David, you and he may yet sail together again. Pray for his safety, but do not grieve his loss. He is far better off than we are, and I expect he is awake with fear and worry for you. He knows I am with you, and will never leave you, so that will offer him comfort."
He looked back to the place where Dave had lain, unable to sleep.
"Go lie down. I will help you sleep. You need rest, David."
Dave could feel the magic sinking into him already, and knew he would pass out soon. He stumbled back to the place he had been, and did not even have time to cover up. Shannon took the blanket and, kneeling, he covered Dave with it. He nearly moved away back into the shadows, but instead knelt beside Tavia and Travis. Tavia slept restlessly, and the blankets had tangled, so neither she nor Travis had much. He pulled the wool cover smooth over them both and touched her forehead with a light brush of the tips of his fingers.
"Be at peace, woman,"
he whispered in Krausen. After a moment, he rose and left the company deep in sleep to stand watch in the dark. The highest-ranking man of the cloth would always lead the prayers. That task fell on Riven this time. He prepared himself while Oirion set up the small altar and filled the little battered cup from the last wineskin. There was no bread, just leftover bits of dried clams, a few nuts, and a couple of raisins that were laid beside the makeshift chalice. Riven looked at the pitiful sight and felt sorry for these people. He had done more with less, but that was either by himself or with other clerics, never for the people the church was supposed to protect from these sorts of situations. They all gathered around the little altar. Even Ivan knelt with his head bowed, although he held back and did not say any words. Shannon didn't move from the doorway but stood watching. Riven was not going to invite the man. He could join them or not. Centering on prayer, he bowed his own head and let his body relax. Drawing a breath, he began,
"Father, be with us."
He had no doubt they all knew the prayers. It would be a rare nation not to belong to the church. The common language and common prayers helped to bind the people and races together against the darkness and the things that bred in it. Whispering the words of the prayer and letting his power rise, Riven lifted the little cup to bless it and then the bits of food. Setting them down again, he prayed in silence for God to guide them and aid them in this place. Heart calmed, he lifted the wine and gave each a little sip with the blessing of,
"May God's light fill you."
Then each received a tiny bit of food placed on their tongues, all but Oirion, who took it in his hand to put in his own mouth. With the ceremony over, wine shared, and edibles split among them, Riven lifted his hands in a final prayer and whispered it over the group. He heard them all breathe out in relief as they stayed kneeling together for some time. Then, all at once, they got up, released from the prayer's power, and moved to the door. Everyone shouldered the packs the captain had tossed into the lifeboat as his final gesture of foresight. The leftovers that they had brought on the raft were down to a few empty bread tins and just the pouches for raisins and candied fruit. But those were empty now. Each pack still had the basic gear that was needed to survive, including a blanket and a few trinkets to trade with. Tavia was prepared to carry too, but Riven took the boy's pack and blanket. He wasn't about to let her try to carry extra weight in addition to the boy. They all got a canteen that was filled with the last of the wine and some water. Shannon, however, took no wine in his and allowed them to split his share. With everyone ready, as the first light of morning rose up, nearly hidden behind a bank of thick, dark clouds that clung to the horizon, they set out. Thank you for listening. More chapters are available. Join our Patreon at patreon.com/2ravens801